Welcome to the first episode in what I hope will be a powerful new series of podcasts looking into the world of journalism and how journalism functions in times of war. This format is going to be called The Fog of War, Journalism on the Front Line. And I'm delighted to be joined by my co-presenter, co-host, and co-creator of this slot, which is Yaroslav Buchta. In a minute, she's going to do the introductions to our fantastic guests today. But just to let you know, do subscribe to the channel because we intend to produce material at least once a week, if we can, more than once a week, and interview some of the world's leading frontline journalists, and especially those who've had experience of this long and traumatic war in Ukraine, which of course shows no signs of ending. Now over to you, Yaroslava. Please introduce our fantastic guests.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And yes, it's a great delight to be starting this new project to basically talk about how knowledge about the warfare and about this current Russian-Ukrainian war is produced in the world and what we basically know about what's going on. So it is beyond thrilling to introduce our first guests. First one is Iryna Matviyishyn, who has been working as a journalist for more than 8 years, covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine pre-2022 and afterwards as a former video correspondent of Kyiv Independent, reporting on the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Iryna also used to work as a local producer for the NPR and joined the live broadcasts of CNN, BBC, Times Radio, and a number of other world media, and currently works as a freelance journalist. And Johana Kotisova, who is expert and a researcher and an anthropologist who works specifically on the emotions within journalism. And she's an assistant professor in documentary and journalism at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Amsterdam. So thank you very much to our speakers for joining us today. And it's really great because it's sort of bridging the two expertises of kind of from the field and from the research side. And this is something like the dialogue that we intend to develop further within this channel, within this project. And I would like to start with a question first to Iryna, with a more kind of general question. So what is it that journalists actually do today as for the moment? So how is it different from different times, different wars, other wars, if any different? And what does it actually mean to be a journalist? And what does it mean to be a journalist, a Ukrainian journalist, reporting on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I mean, thank you first of all, thank you for having me here. And it's a pleasure to talk to you. I think I haven't given interviews for quite a long time. Now I need to structure my thoughts clearly about what I've lived through and what I've been doing for the past year. Sometimes as a journalist, you don't have a lot of opportunities to reflect. But of course, if we speak about the general purpose of a journalist, it's reporting the truth, reporting on the events that are happening. I perceive journalism as some kind of craftsmanship that you need to develop your skills and you need to reflect the truth and you need to present the facts, but also, of course, there's some higher purpose for it, and that higher purpose is to not only blindly report on the facts, but to see which facts, to fact check them, to see which facts have been manipulated or could be manipulative, and to balance. I do not believe in objectivity. Maybe we will come to that point in discussion, but I believe that we need to have a clear and healthy judgment of the events that we are reporting on. And being a journalist in Ukraine is challenging in that regard because, of course, you are not an outsider. You are someone that is very engaged in everything that is happening. In our case, the war in our own country. Many of us have friends, relatives, close loved ones who are fighting. So war is something personal. It's not something that we read in the news and we have a vague idea about it. It's something that we think about every day. We wake up with the same realization about the war, with building knowledge of this war based on personal experience. So yeah, it's very emotional, but at the same time, at the same time, it's very challenging for a journalist in Ukraine to stay true to your values and to stay true to your purpose and report on everything that's happening without, with minimum bias as possible. And at the same time to remain a citizen and to remain patriot of your country. And I mean, in our case, it's of course much easier than in the Russian case, because Ukraine is fighting for justice and for truth and for freedom, and it's a just war. But still, there are some moments, and sometimes we need to ask ourselves questions whether I should do this, like how my heart feels, or should I follow some kind of standard? Yeah.
I was going to jump right in with a question there, but this is perhaps one which Johana may have a crack at too. And that is, you talk about objectivity. I think definitely we should come to that again. But many Ukrainians I speak to in London, Oxford, and other places, they have this overriding kind of, let's call it a complaint, and it's a very justified one. And that is that in many instances, professionals in other fields, even academics and other experts, will almost think of Ukrainians as being too close to the reality. They will think that Ukrainians are not just giving a truth according to their experience of reality, but are, let's say, sort of clouded or distorted by emotion because they're too close to events. I'm really keen to hear, one, whether you've had this experience, and of course, if you have, it must be incredibly frustrating, but also why it's not necessarily true.
I encountered this kind of attitude on many occasions, and since I've been working primarily with English-speaking journalism, so I interacted a lot with foreign journalists. I see and I'm following how foreign correspondents work in Ukraine and communicate with editors and with reporters who came to Ukraine to report from the ground, to whom I assisted as a local producer. And of course, based on your role, the attitude of the journalist, let's say, or an editor from abroad might differ. So if you're a Ukrainian journalist, they might trust you more than a local producer, let's say, but at the same time, if you sometimes, and that's what I saw across my field in Ukraine, and that's what Ukrainian journalists were complaining about sometimes, that if they were if they wanted to suggest a piece to a foreign media, for example, and the foreign media could opt between a foreign correspondent in Ukraine or a Ukrainian reporting from the ground, they would more likely choose a foreign correspondent because they trust him more, because it's a Westerner, or that's a person who is not involved in the events. It's not only me, but many of my colleagues, and sometimes I'm seeing discussions on these journalists groups in Ukraine. I saw cases, like how people reflect on these cases, and it's not always good, and this bias still exists. Many foreign correspondents and editors think that Ukrainians are have some sort of bias because they are traumatized, because they are too emotional. They cannot think clearly because of everything they lived through. And yeah, it puts you in an unequal position in terms of your professionality, in terms of your experience, because at the same time, Ukrainians surely know their country more than any other outsider that came just when the full-scale invasion started. And we've seen, I think everyone who was following the developments in Ukraine since 2014 and 2022 could have seen this drastic change in attention to Ukraine, but at the same time, a huge gap knowledge about Ukraine, because many people jumped from other conflict zones, other countries, just because they needed to be on this media wave, to sell their reports, and they came to Ukraine to make their career. I mean, it sounds cynical, but it's the truth of the of the field, and especially for freelancers, it was a great opportunity to enhance their careers and build some experience in a war zone, which didn't look like, I don't know, maybe it didn't look like Syria or Afghanistan, but at the same time, they were safe areas where they could present themselves as war reporters, but still build up some valuable experience. So yeah, it's quite challenging. I personally don't feel it directly right now because I work mostly with less famous media. I try not to aim too big, not to be rejected too much. But I think the attitude changed a bit because of the full-scale invasion. Because surely, like, you can send a foreign correspondent, but at the same time, you need some voice from the ground. You need a local voice. And surely some Ukrainian journalists who speak English, who have some experience in the English-speaking environment, sometimes they are invited to such media. But again, the priority is always given to a native. And yeah, that's some kind of also a minority complex, maybe on the side of Ukrainians, not towards the attitude towards Russians, but towards, for example, Americans. Sometimes they feel less important than let's say an American journalist who came to Ukraine, and maybe that's also something that impacted this kind of attitude.
Thanks so much. If I
Johana.
may react, because Iryna, you've just mentioned so many things that I also encountered in my research, for which I was interviewing reporters covering the Russian-Ukrainian war, including local producers and fixers, and including Ukrainian journalists. And quite some of them mentioned this emotional gap, the so-called emotional gap between Ukrainian journalists who are inside the story, who are on the ground, who are a part of the community they're reporting on, and the foreigners who sometimes come only for a short period of time, especially the so-called parachute reporters, and they read one book on a plane and they don't have enough knowledge, so they perceive this emotional gap, this cleavage between those who are emotionally involved and those who are neutral or detached and very unemotional, and sometimes also cynical. And sometimes this emotional gap would indeed lead to this, what I perceive as epistemic injustice, the lack of trust given to Ukrainians just because they're Ukrainians. And I think in what you were talking about, Iryna, we could really hear something that I would definitely agree with, that it is a bias, that Ukrainians are biased, because it is not the emotionality that often causes the prejudice, but it's the lack of knowledge of the context. And I was trying to see, or I was trying to discover how emotions are actually, what role emotions actually play in the knowledge production and in the reporting. So I was looking at the different forms of epistemic value that emotions can have in reporting on the war. And I actually found out that there are many ways how the emotional engagement of local journalists and fixers and producers are valued as a form of embodied knowledge, and as something that leads to more ethical reporting, for example. And it's something that adds the context and adds the depth of the knowledge about Ukraine. So in reality, I think that when there are mixed teams, when there are teams where foreign reporters collaborate with local producers and fixers. I think that very often people actually value this different affective proximity to the context, so that people think that it's actually productive for the reporting when there's someone who has more of a conceptual bird's eye view and someone who has a more in-depth embodied historical knowledge of the context.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say that I had experienced many of such situations, especially as a local producer. And sometimes when you're a local producer, you are supposed to provide everything a journalist is asking for. And sometimes it could like come up to some absurdity. For example, we would be reporting, I don't want to be very precise, but we would be reporting in the field in the early stage of the invasion, and a correspondent who was, as you say, parachuted into Ukraine from some state in the US, and he has never left, and it was his first experience abroad as a correspondent, but also as a war correspondent. And he's asking, like, let's find a storage of wheat, which is being, like, at this moment, wheat is being a target for Russia, and Ukrainians were trying to conceal the locations and the storages. So nobody from the officials wanted to comment on that. And the correspondent would keep asking, like, would keep pushing, no, you should find information about this. We need to find where it is. And of course, like, if you start asking people on the street, someone will eventually tell you the location, but what is the purpose of that? So my colleague who was working with such a correspondent, she refused to interview people about this topic. She said it's too dangerous. Like, I don't want to put workers at this storage and to put like tons of wheat to jeopardize it, because like later a Russian missile might land there. And she refused, and later she faced the consequences. She was kind of ghosted, not even fired. Yeah, so it was very clear sometimes that this bias, just because you are perceived as someone who really cares about your country, it was harming it was harming the perception of you as a professional, but also like it was contradicting your professional competencies. And in my case, it was very frustrating sometimes, because I know that I have more experience as a journalist in Ukraine, and someone who just came tells me, no, you're not valid. You have nothing to say because you're like a Ukrainian. So yeah, it was. It's quite a common thing. I think many put up with it, but also there are a lot. I should note that there are a lot of good journalists who understand that they are not as competent as someone who spent like 20 or 10 years working in Ukraine. So it also depends on a person a lot.
Because I think this has changed since the full-scale invasion. I was doing most of my research before that. But what we saw after the full-scale invasion, after February 2022, was, I think, an inflow of journalists or media or content creators, basically, who wanted to, as you said, they wanted to build their careers, and they didn't have much sense of professional standards and ethics. And that also affected their way of collaborating with local producers and fixers. So yeah, I think that the type of media professionals or media or workers has changed since the full-scale invasion. It became kind of an easy context to go to and to build your career. And that, of course, affects your professionalism in terms of ethics and knowledge. So yeah,
So it happens. I agree, but it happens a lot with many other countries and conflicts. Look now at Lebanon. Everyone just rushed there because it's a hot spot and there's a lot of news, and people, like especially freelancers, need to sell stories. So that's something like freelancing is a very hard job, but also it's very like commercially driven, because of course you need to live for something and you need to sell stories, and sometimes you can't sell stories when you're staying in one place for too long and nothing big is happening, so you need to find new places. And I understand this kind of migration of journalists, but of course sometimes it comes to extreme, and I know people who jump from one country to another and they're just like unstoppable, like non-stop traveling around and looking for crazy news. Yeah, so you can't build much competence on that, of course, and some of them don't even count on building competence. Their job is like just to sell news or pictures or videos, whatever. So yeah, it's as in any other field, I would say it depends on the personality and personal like values, why you're doing journalism. But also, of course, it has some effects on the general perception of the country or the conflict.
Yeah, actually, this is something I wanted to ask both of you, because you both like work somehow with other contexts and other wars, say. So like a more general question, I guess, is, so local journalists are criticized for being like too emotional, too close to the issue, but aren't foreign correspondents same emotional about the context? So this is something that came up quite a lot post-war in Yugoslavia that they were talking about. It's like, you can't be neutral about genocide. So a broader question that emerges, what are the journalistic standards? And basically we're kind of undermining objectivity as a concept. It doesn't matter anymore, it seems so. So what are the new rules that journalism should be built upon, and how this all should be happening? And maybe you could reflect a little bit more on this in the context of other conflicts. I know that Johana has interviewed people from who worked as fixers, for example, in Palestine, right? Am I right? Yeah. And Iryna has worked with a number of journalists who have already been to other conflict zones. And yeah, so maybe we can start with Johana and then Iryna. And yeah.
Regarding objectivity, I think that's the type of objectivity that some journalists still aim to pursue. Take a step back and look at the concept of objectivity, because I think that the form of objectivity that many journalists aim to pursue is very hypocritical and non-existent. This whole idea of being detached or neutral or unemotional, it is a story that journalism likes to tell about itself because it needs to, and it has needed to for some reasons, for some historical reasons. But currently I perceive a shift towards the notion of so-called strong objectivity that also incorporates your standpoint, that also incorporates your perspective and your positionality and the way your knowledge and your journalism is inevitably classed, gendered, raced, and so on. So I think that in this strong objectivity, the emotional engagement, which is a form of attachment stemming from positionality, definitely has its place, and it has to somehow redefine the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity and rationality and emotionality. This is something that journalism really needs to carefully look into, and something that it really needs to do to redefine this and to look into how it is changing. Or and I think that the context where people report on wars happening in their own community is very inspiring in this, because they need to really face the core question of journalism. How do you do journalism when the traditional form of objectivity is out of question? The neutrality or detachment is just impossible. How do you do journalism? And they, like, at least in Ukraine, I think journalists have been dealing with this question very well. They are also critical of their own context, of the media policies of their own government, which is a good sign of like a healthy media ecosystem, I think. And there is definitely a lot of inspiration to draw from.
I agree that everyone comes into the country with their own bias. Let's say, maybe it's too loud of a word, but still we have our imagination about the world, our views on the situations and conflicts, and of course everyone has some preconceptions before they come to Ukraine. I think in case of Ukraine, there are two categories of people. There are those who, like foreign correspondents. There are those who are staying in the country for quite a long time, and they start to understand the situation and to dive deep into the context, and they become the communicators of on the truth, but also like they are more sympathetic to Ukrainians, I would say. Many of those foreign correspondents are staying in Ukraine, they live in the context, and they have more understanding also through this emotional bias, because they are living through the same attacks as Ukrainians do. They see that it's tough to live in Ukraine, like if there are power outages or constant attacks and many other side effects and consequences of war that influence your life. So they also come with certain bias, but then when they dive into the context, they live through this emotional perception, and they become sort of biased, as we can say, as some people say about Ukrainians, emotionally speaking. But there are other journalists who are parachuted and they are traveling back and forth, and they are not immersed into this context. So they might present themselves as more objective, but that's just because they don't have an emotional connection to it. And I agree with Yaroslava that this emotionality also brings some kind of depth to the reporting, and sometimes it can be lasts more, and sometimes it can be extreme, but at the same time it brings the understanding, and it gives you a glimpse into how people live and deeper meaning to the reporting.
Yeah, can I also add something to the foreign versus local distinction, because I think this is also a bit invalid, because as Iryna mentioned, there are so many people who got naturalized kind of in Ukraine, who started living there and who have families there, who have partners, friends, who really know the context very well. And many of the local journalists and local producers and fixers, they are very international, and they are also not completely locals.
Continuing this, local, global, and proximity. So there has been this thing within Ukrainian bureaus being opened for the major media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, like Kiev bureaus. And what happened on various occasions was that chief editors appointed to these bureaus were actually people coming from Moscow bureaus, or people who have been in Russia for a while before that. And there was this kind of common thing that a person is sent to Moscow to report on everything that used to be this like post-Soviet space, as they call it. And their expertise was considered to be enough to report on the whole region. And this happened like to the New York Times Kiev bureau, it happened to Washington Post Kiev bureau. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about the enoughness of this expertise? What do you think about what maybe deeper issues does this reveal to us, given that the full-scale invasion has started by Russia against Ukraine, and then they're sending somebody who's been in Russia for like 20 years in Ukraine to be in Ukraine and to lead the Kiev bureau? Is it even an issue? So what consequences can it have?
So to me, like the fact that they were sent to Ukraine is not that surprising, because the whole it's not only about media, but the whole like cultural / informational space in the world was built around, like, through the lens of Russia. And since the full-scale invasion broke out, everyone was in shock, like those people who were not following closely the events from 2014 and were not really immersed into the Ukrainian reality. They were caught off guard, and to them it was something like extremely new, and they did not perceive it as a strange thing to move from Moscow to Ukraine. Also, like in terms of international journalists, it's quite a common thing that you're relocated from one place to another, and many times, like on many occasions, this place doesn't have to be really connected to some other part of the world. And I've seen it also with correspondence being sent from India to Ukraine, or from I don't know, China to Ukraine. So in their perception, it's okay. And in terms of like professional mobility, it's also nothing incredible. But what happened is that many of these journalists, like, even though they were reporting for foreign media and they were outsiders, they were not Russians, they were not perceiving the country on the same level as Russians who consumed Russian propaganda and things like this. But at the same time, they had certain prejudices and perceptions that would shape their thinking, and this Russian lens was still present. And it would not be that evident from the beginning, but it would just like be something slight in the reporting, some wording, a phrase that would give it away, you know. And I mean, it's something very common, and not only from people who have lived in Russia. It can be also like a person who reported from India or from London or Paris, just because this Russian lens was a common lens to look at Ukraine and at the world. And I think there are two sides to it. There's this part that the person lived in Russia for too long, and it might be infiltrated with some ideas or perceptions of Ukrainian history or present or recent history that is not completely true or twisted. But there's also this general bias towards Ukraine and like general misunderstanding of Ukraine. And I think it's wrong to appoint a person who has been a chief of the bureau in Moscow in Ukraine just because it's an invasion, and it's kind of surreal to have a correspondent who reported on Russia moving to Ukraine. I don't know, like to me it's wrong, but at the same time I understand the policies of the newsrooms, and I understand how this media environment works and the mobility of journalists. It's not always correct, and it's in most cases it's incorrect, and in most cases it's wrong, and they send people who have like basic understanding or twisted understanding of the situation. And even in case of the Western media I was working for, we had an editor who was an American and who was editing pieces for the American media, but at the same time he was of Indian origin, and he was quite biased, as I understood later, in terms of how he was correcting the pieces, and eventually how he reflected on my work based on my origin. So yeah, it's something very common and disappointing, but at the same time, that's the reality of the media market. And in terms of Moscow correspondence, I would say that it's a wrong choice, because there are so many talented journalists. I'm not even speaking about Ukrainian ones. If they don't trust Ukrainians, I'm fine with that. But there are many talented journalists who have worked in the region, maybe not in Moscow, but in closer countries, and they know Ukraine better, or they know Ukraine through the lens of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think this points to a general need for a shift in knowledge production and the centers of knowledge production, and maybe like decentralizing and like shifting where or how the knowledge emerges about Ukraine. And also it points to, I think, a general need to understand Ukrainians and Ukraine better, and from a perspective of a country that has been colonized, rather than from the perspective of the colonizer. I think that's something that you're going to talk about next or in other episodes maybe, but this whole reproduction of this inter-imperialism and the perspective of the stronger party is a big problem, not only in journalism, but generally in knowledge production. And I just wanted to take again a step back and look at what the word bias means, because yeah, sorry for keeping problematizing keeping to problematize concepts, but it can mean a standpoint, and we necessarily all have our standpoints and perspectives, but it can also mean a distortion that can be deliberate, and that can be based on like hiding some information or not seeing information that you should see, and that is a big difference. It is perfectly legitimate to have a certain standpoint and to come into the knowledge production field or produce the reporting from your perspective and from your standpoint and reflect on that. But it's very different from like distorting the news on purpose that we see some journalists or some media are doing.
This idea of bias, I think, and which journalists are appointed to which conflict is another area which perhaps can introduce extreme bias. So you may have journalists who've worked on Yugoslavia, you may have journalists who've worked on Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've heard from some people, and this includes analysts as well, they arrive in Ukraine expecting a similar scenario of Yugoslavia, multiple nationalities, complexities about people who do or don't want to be part of a particular entity, and they overlay that on. And of course, that helps Russian propaganda myths about Donbass and the east of Ukraine being an entirely different country, an entirely different ethnicity. So they're layering on sort of narratives that don't really work in this context. And then their reporting is filtered through that distorting lens. I'd love to hear what you both think about that idea.
Yes, absolutely. I think we can see it in journalism, but in other fields as well. I just talked to some journalists who collaborate with therapists. And so now there's this trend that media-oriented NGOs or media advocacy groups or organizations try to help Ukrainian journalists by bringing in therapists, and because the expertise that therapists need is the closest to the expertise of the military or military psychologists. They bring in psychologists with experience from other conflicts, from Afghanistan or other conflicts, but it just doesn't work. It's a very different context and a very different country. And I think that's a part of the problem, that people don't see the importance of context and the specifics of context in journalism, but in other fields as well.
Again, everyone comes to a reporting field with their own like build-up imagination of the world, and depending on what they were reading, what they were watching, and how they were perceiving the world, like through which countries, they build up some sort of perception of Ukraine. And it's not only like the media, it's also, I encountered it a lot with the security advisors, for example, for the media, because usually when you are a local producer, like when you work with a team or from a big media, you always have a security advisor. Like you move around with a person who is watching the protocol, who is like trying to avoid dangerous situation and build the safest route. And at the beginning of the war, I don't know how it is now because I'm not working as local, but the first year of the war, it was sometimes it was ridiculous because these security advisors would be sent from usually the UK or Ireland, sometimes the US. They would have some military experience, and they would be based in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria before, and then they come to Ukraine. They know nothing about Ukraine. I don't know how they could have been appointed as security advisors, but start giving you advices, like you to a Ukrainian who has lived in your country. They start giving you advices on what to do and where to go based on their understanding from the Afghanistan or Iraq. And sometimes it would really lead us to either ridiculous or even more dangerous situations. I had one case when we were planning a trip in Ivano-Frankivsk, which is kind of the safe area, but at the beginning of the war, it was also a target. Like the strategic facilities were targeted. So we were trying to avoid any kind of strategic facilities, and we were finding the hotel somewhere further from these facilities. And eventually, when I come to my room, I open the curtains, and what I see is like a huge TV tower with military people walking around. It was because the security advisor thought that the strategic facility is only a nuclear power plant or an huge infrastructure, like a power station, and that's it. So, and we encountered it on many occasions. And I mean, you can't, like, if you're an international correspondent, of course, you have to build an expertise, and you don't always stay in the same country. You're developing your knowledge on the world by traveling and by discovering different cultures and political situations. And sometimes for some people it plays a good role. Like actually they benefit from it because their understanding of how things work. They understand that the world is not that simple. That sometimes if you are, I don't know, pro-Palestine, you can be also pro-Ukrainian, and you can be also like pro-Jewish, and it doesn't exclude each other. But some people, I don't know, I believe that it's based on your personal like level of judgment. Sometimes you can have all kinds of experience and see the world through different lenses, but again, come with your own biases. So I believe it also comes to your personal judgment, personality, character, I don't know, common sense. Sometimes it's just like common sense. Some people don't want to see other truths, whether they traveled or not. They might have not traveled and built other expertise in other regions, but they still come with their own biases. I'm not sure how do you explain it academically, but I believe that some people just lack common sense.
That was really a great discussion. I feel like we can continue it for forever, because we are sort of tackling the main kind of pillars of journalism, such as objectivity, such as emotions in journalism, biases, and who comes with what. And I feel like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, has produced a major kind of field in media studies and in journalism to reflect on itself and then to think of what it is now. And I'm really, really happy that our discussion starts with such amazing statements. And I'm extremely grateful to both of our speakers. And thank you, Jonathan. And we hope you follow us for more episodes and for more discussions, for more delving into this war's context, other war's context, and the discussion of basically how we navigate the modern media, the modern social media, and technological advancements. And follow us for more.
Thanks so much. Yeah, sorry for the terrible connection.
It was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.